mysteries in the deserts of Mexico, mythological monsters in your backyard, and disturbing discoveries along forgotten trails. Brace yourself. Today's episode features allegedly true and extremely creepy stories about things people have seen and found in the wilderness. Now, let's begin. Back in 2018, I had moved my family into a new developing neighborhood. We finally had enough money to put a down payment on a house and move out of the apartment we had been living in for so long. My wife had recently gotten a job, and together we were able to achieve a comfortable living, at least only for the first few weeks that we had moved in. I've got two boys, one is 11, the other is 13. It's a blessing in disguise when I'm at work and my wife needs help with groceries. Otherwise, they can be troublemakers sometimes. That's beside the point of the story, though. This takes place soon after we had moved in and gotten comfortable in our new home. Our neighborhood was at the stage of development where they were still clearing forest and making dirt trails all around. By no means was it anywhere near being complete. There was a lot of forested wilderness surrounding our newly made home, along with the others on our block. During the evening and on some weekends, there weren't many, if not any, construction workers out and about. That's when I'd usually take some time to go on walks around the forested areas of the neighborhood with my wife or with the whole family. My two kids had been gifted a quad by my wife's parents at the time we had moved. Her side had some money. We figured it would be fine since we still lived in an underdeveloped area with not too many neighbors to complain. Additionally, the general area was rural, so there was a lot of places to go besides inside the neighborhood itself. Obviously, there were ground rules. They were not allowed to ride where construction was taking place, and they had to avoid anywhere that had construction workers doing their jobs. And most importantly, they were not allowed to take off without our knowledge, and they couldn't go very far, maybe a few miles away. I remember one afternoon, the two boys were at home playing video games. My wife and I had gone out for a stroll in a new area of the neighborhood. We found a small trail some way into the woods that we had begun to follow. We made an effort to go out at least once every other day on a walk or hike to get exercise and stay in shape. Since this was still a new area, we enjoyed finding new places to explore. We had walked a good amount into the woods at this point, a few miles at least. We had continued into the trail until it had kind of broken off and stopped. There was no real designated path to follow now, but we continued in a direction that appeared to be a bit more treaded down than the rest of the landscape. We eventually came to a clearing in the middle of nowhere. No distinct entrance or exit trail from this area. The first thing we picked up on were the huge trash piles scattered around, some of it just random junk piled together, and other stuff grouped in black bags. It wasn't odd at first, but it definitely had no connection to the neighborhood or construction. I'd wondered who put all this stuff here. The first few apparent things I saw here were an old torn-up couch and a toboggan among the scattered piles in their own specific locations. The funny thing was, it was the middle of summer, and it was ironic seeing a toboggan in the middle of the woods. It was at this point that I noticed the couch had two trash bags sitting on top of it. One was tied while the other one seemed to have been ripped open forcefully at one point. Nothing seemed to have come out, but I was a little interested to see what was inside. Nothing smelled bad in this area, and the trash all around just seemed to be old household junk, so I figured why not take a peek. Besides, you know the old saying, one man's trash is another man's treasure. I walked over with my wife behind me, notably a little skeptical. I pried open the bag a little more. The bag was stuffed with something. It came to the point where I'd made a big enough gap for whatever was inside to start falling out. It was the last thing I expected to come out. A bunch of old dolls. Not your typical Barbie and Ken dolls either. These dolls were vintage. I nearly soiled myself when the bag had begun to pour out with these things. The bag smelled like oldness. I'm not sure how to word it, but you know what I'm talking about. That stale old odor that often accompanies antiques and relics that you would find deep in the attic of your grandparents' home. My wife began to laugh. Apparently she was more comfortable with dolls because she had grown up playing with them. I've always had a bit of uneasiness with them. They just creeped me out. We poked around some of the other stuff in the area, but didn't find anything else besides a few select antiques. I was curious to find out how all of this stuff ended up here, but I knew I'd probably never find out. We decided enough was enough and headed back to the neighborhood. As we left the clearing, I could swear I heard the faintest sound, like a child laughing coming from deeper in the woods. I got goosebumps and kind of froze up, asking my wife if she heard that, to which she responded no. We held our stance there a moment longer to see if we'd hear it again, but we didn't. It was one of those sounds that's so faint it takes a second time hearing it to confirm you actually heard something in the first place. It was a bit unnerving, but I brushed it off. I guess it was just my nerves getting the best of me. It took us about an hour and a half to walk to that clearing and an hour to get back, since we knew our way around this trail a bit better now. We discussed our findings on the way home, my wife continuing to tease me about those stupid dolls. The next few days carried on normally. After those few days, something strange had happened. One night after supper, we had gotten our kids to sleep and began to watch a movie on our own. It was around midnight that we had finally gone up to bed. We'd gotten all settled in to rest, and suddenly, minutes later, out of nowhere, multiple rings of our doorbell made me jump out of my skin. It was like someone was trying to wake us up and scare us. My wife was startled, asking who in the world would be here at this time. Now, my wife wasn't exactly big on surprises, and she's scared easily in situations like this. I knew I'd have to go down there and check it out myself. As much as I didn't want to, I forced myself to get out of bed and first check through the upstairs window to see my driveway. There was nothing there, meaning either the person was still there or had run off. I whispered to my two sons across the hallway who had awakened, saying, "Stay in bed." I walked down the stairs with my wife trailing a few feet behind me. I opened the door to be greeted by blackness. There was no one. I went into the closet to grab my pistol and walked out with it in hand, ready for the worst. Still, there was no one out there. It was dead silent, with no light illuminating a presence. I said nothing. All I did was walk back inside and tell my wife whoever was out there was gone now. I stayed up the rest of the night while my family slept, just to be cautious. No one came back. The next day was normal, but we were out for most of the day. I had dropped the boys off at a summer camp, and my wife and I went out for the day. We eventually came home to relax for a bit before picking up the boys. After we came to pick them up, we went out to eat. We arrived back in the evening after dark. As we walked up to the front porch, I heard one of my sons exclaim, "Hey, Dad, look! A package!" My wife and I exchanged confused glances. Neither of us had ordered anything, and we couldn't think of a reason why there was a package out on the front porch. It was dark, and we hadn't installed a front light yet. My son handed me the package, and upon further inspection, I knew something was seriously wrong here. It wasn't a package, it was some sort of really old board game. I brought it inside and set it down on the table. My wife told the two boys to go upstairs and said we would be there in a moment. Unsuspecting, they went upstairs, unaware of the bizarreness of the situation. On the box was a label, Atomic Energy Lab. There was a sticker that was placed on the box, written in poor handwriting, "For your boys." I opened the box, and stuff was missing inside of it. The stuff that was in it, however, was a bunch of old, unfamiliar scientific instruments. I was confused, and I looked it up online. This was no ordinary game. It was old, almost a century. The box was in poor condition, but it was still sturdy enough to hold everything inside of it. Apparently, I found it on some sort of list for banned historical toys on some website. To be exact, the name of this toy, or whatever, was the Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Laboratory. What kind of sick joke was this? Apparently, there were samples of uranium in this science experiment kit. How could someone possibly have gotten their hands on something this old? And why would they leave it at our front door? We reported it to the police, who took it from us, but couldn't really do much else. The only lead we had was to check out the area where we'd found the dolls, since those looked old too. But the chances of these two things being connected just seemed all too distant. Nonetheless, we told them about it, and they checked it out a few days later. We called back for further information. What they told us was probably the most disturbing news I've ever received in my lifetime. The police officer's words went along the lines of, "You're lucky you never stepped foot in that clearing again after that." Me and my team were shocked. Dolls hanging from trees and strewn about the ground. Definitely not how it looked when you guys were there, huh? The dolls on the ground were stomped and dismembered. There was a Ouija board on the ground and a couple bags filled with old animal bones, we discovered. Everything else in the area seemed to have been set on fire with gasoline and turned to rubble. There were no houses anywhere nearby, but further down in the forest, we actually found an abandoned house. Did you guys happen to see that? I was dumbstruck. I remember further down the trail back when I heard the laughter. I had tears in my eyes now. I was in shock. We responded no. He continued on and mentioned how the abandoned house had one unique feature, a doll in each room. We thanked him, and he said he'd place a patrol car in the neighborhood for the next few weeks to help keep our peace of mind. Regardless, we were both very shaken. We did our best to prevent our kids from finding any of this out, and to this day, it's worked. We believe it's better to hold off on telling them the truth about all that happened here until they get a bit older. For a while, nothing happened after that. We still decided to move, though, a month later. Not far, but about 30 minutes away, in an already established neighborhood. The last thing that happened before we left took place in the final week of us living there while we were preparing to move. Once again, at around midnight, someone had rung our doorbell. Only once this time. I hadn't answered it. All my wife and I did was bring our 2 sons to our room to sleep for the night and have the doors locked. The next morning, I got up early to discover one last thing on the doorstep. The head of one of those old dolls. Nothing else. We threw it out and pretended it never happened. I just can't imagine how messed up some people are. Who could it have been, though? It made no sense. Was someone watching us in those woods? Was it a sick neighbor? I'll never be able to say for sure. All I can say is don't go into places that look best to avoid altogether. A lesson I've learned to remember for the rest of my life. As I mentioned before, we did our best to prevent our kids from finding out about any of this, and to this day it has worked. We believe it's better to hold off on telling them the truth about everything that happened there until they're older, so they can handle the truth about how different this world is from their innocent and bulletproof perspective. I can't believe someone would be screwed up enough to try and sabotage 2 kids' childhoods like that. Thankfully, it wasn't the case for us and for anyone listening. I hope it never ends up that way for your kids. Always be cautious out there and stay safe. As a child and throughout my teenage years, my parents and I would travel to their hometown in a desert valley in Mexico. I know that's a broad description that could mean a lot of different places in Mexico, and that's as much information as I can give about the location. I just think it's important to establish a bit of context for the story. It's a small village. Back then it had about 300 residents max. People who lived there were largely sheltered from the modern world, with electricity only being scarcely available, and usually only used to draw water from wells by the lucky few who owned electric water pumps, as well as light a few street lamps on the main dirt road that passed through the center of town. Very few people had cars that worked, and of course, those that did work were in rough condition. Women still aren't allowed to drive in that area and the surrounding villages. There is also a loudspeaker in the center of the town that can be heard throughout the valley that is used to make public announcements. It was seldom used, usually only for emergencies. The homes of most of the town residents were quite primitive. The homes were made of adobe, mud bricks, with clay shingles on the roofs, and still are to this day. Only a few could afford concrete, and even then, it was only used to coat the outside of the adobe to extend its life. The houses only had 2 or 3 exterior walls, meaning that half of the dwelling is open air and exposed. There might be a few bedrooms with dividing walls, but the living rooms, dining rooms, and other common areas are not enclosed by walls. This meant that we basically lived outside during our stays, just like everybody else. I think it's because of this constant connection with nature and the elements that I experienced a lot of weird things out there in the desert of Mexico. One night while eating in the town center with my good friend, we were about 12 or 13 at the time. A group of men rode up to our table, which was outside, basically in the road, and offered us both jobs moving cattle. It's not uncommon for kids to accept jobs like this on the spot. In fact, that year my bud and I managed to find work almost every day. We were usually either paid with money or a full meal and a six-pack of beer in the evenings. So we finished our food quickly and followed them to the edge of town, where they had horses waiting for us. We mounted up and followed the rest of the men out into the desert. It was a clear night with enough moonlight to not need any flashlights. Either way, we were strictly told no lights. That area of Mexico is pretty desolate and scarcely populated, so the stars out there were amazing. On our long trek to our destination, we had plenty of time to look upwards and gaze at the stars. Seeing shooting stars every night out there is normal, so we competed to see who could count the most before the night was done. "There goes one of the slow ones," said my friend, in Spanish, of course. "What?" I replied, not having the slightest idea of what he meant. He pointed up and said, "Look, right there." His finger moved across the sky. "Oh," I said, understanding now what he was talking about. "It's a satellite." He looked down from the sky and over at me with a confused expression. It turns out he had never heard the Spanish word for satellite and didn't understand what I was talking about. I explained to him as best as I could what satellites were and what we use them for, and how we shoot them into space, and how the solar panels sometimes reflect light down to us, and so on. It was almost a completely foreign concept to him, and I could tell it was difficult for him to grasp the idea. We rode on in silence for a while, with our eyes pointed upward. As I looked at the sky, taking in as much as I could, I saw a star appear out of nowhere. A star literally just turned on in front of me. "Hey, did you see that?" asked my friend, pointing up once again. "Yeah, that was weird," I said. "Keep looking. There's always more," he said, excitedly. So I kept an eye on the new star and its little area of space surrounding it. And sure enough, pop, another one appeared out of the darkness. What could that be? I thought. I tried rationalizing it and tried to make sense of it, but I couldn't. They didn't move or anything, but they were visibly brighter than any of the stars near them. We saw one more appear that night, and as far as I know, they never went out or turned out or disappeared. Since that night, I've witnessed a handful of these stars or lights that just appear in the night sky of Mexico, and I've even seen one appear right above the horizon that blinked every now and then. It didn't twinkle and blur like a normal star would. It was a solid on and off. I witnessed this in front of my older brother while we stood on a very tall hill near the edge of town. I told him about it, and he stood up on an old wooden bench to get a better look, but it never blinked while he watched it. Oddly enough, an earthquake rolled through the valley at that exact moment. It didn't tear houses down or crack the earth apart. It was a very mild one. It was the only earthquake I've ever felt, and it terrified me. Once it rolled through and the land stopped shaking, I looked back at the horizon to see the star blink again, but now I couldn't find it at all. Anyway, back to that night with my pal. I asked him what he thought they were, but he just shrugged. After about 2 hours of riding in the moonlight, we arrived at the property line of one of the men. His entire property was fenced in with barbed wire, with the exception of this really long gate. The owner opened it and gave us all orders and positions to take along the giant herd of cattle. We led the cattle away from the ranch for only about an hour, but we rode fast over hills and brush. It was an exciting night of excellent work with an excellent horse. Once we made it to the owner's new stretch of land, he instructed us to head back to town and leave the horses with someone who would be waiting for us, and paid us very well. My friend and I gladly took our payment, and we started heading back to town. We were in no hurry since it was already late in the night and figured we could just sleep in the next morning, although that would likely not be possible because of the noise created by people out and about once the sun rises. but we would be content enough to stay in bed until 6 or 7 a.m. So we rode back to town at a very comfortable pace for both of us and the horses, again with our eyes looking upwards for most of the ride. That was until we heard a strange sound that rolled over the hills. It alarmed us because it was a very familiar sound, yet it was unlike anything I'd ever heard. When out on the bare hills of the rocky desert, if you shoot any type of firearm, the initial bang of the round going off quickly dissipates, and what remains is this roaring echo that constantly fills the air for a few seconds and then suddenly stops. The echo doesn't fade away like you would expect it to. It just stops. This prolonged echo is what we heard that night. The only thing is, there was no bang. There was no audible source of the echo. The only sound in the air was a rumbling echo that would grow and then suddenly stop. Initially, we thought someone was firing at us. It wouldn't have been the first time, but we pretty much figured it wasn't gunfire, from the lack of any sound indicating a gunshot. But the sound was getting louder and louder, and it even seemed to be getting closer. The fluctuations in the sound were becoming clearer every time we heard it. We stood around, just listening to the phenomenon, trying to figure out what exactly it was, but it was nothing we'd ever heard before. This feeling that it was getting closer to us started to make me nervous and scared. "Let's go," I said to my friend. He pulled on his reins, turning his horse around, and stood up on his stirrups and whipped his horse. They took off like a bullet. I expected him to agree with my recommendation to get going, but I didn't expect him to take off so suddenly and without saying anything. The way he turned around and sped off in the blink of an eye really scared me. Did he see something that I didn't? Is there something he knows that I don't? I wondered. These thoughts pierced my chest with fear and panic, and I too rode that horse as fast as I could. I didn't know my way back to town all that well, but I followed my friend's dust, and we both made it back safely. A few days later, while walking through town with my bud, the loudspeaker rang, and the announcer notified the town that a very large herd of cattle was recently stolen from Pico's ranch, and he was looking for any information about anyone who was involved. Pico at the time was the head of the drug smugglers in the region. His name wasn't Pico, but I'm not about to use his real name or nickname. We both stopped in our tracks and looked at each other. He burst out laughing and almost fell over in the street. I didn't take the news so lightly, though. I had just helped steal from a very dangerous group of people that I had done a very good job of avoiding up until then. "Don't worry," he said. "There's no way they could know it was us. It was dark, and none of those guys we were with even live around here. They were complete strangers." Still, I was very deeply worried, and was on edge for the rest of my time there during that vacation. Now as an adult and a father, I think back to that night and feel so disturbingly uneasy. Things could have turned out very badly. My friend was right. I didn't know those people. They were indeed complete strangers. They could have been cartel members themselves looking for an easy way to take hostages or recruits. I could have easily disappeared without a trace. Sometimes I wonder if my friend knew all along what we were getting into. Maybe he knew the risks, but also knew we would be very well rewarded and was willing to accept those risks. A bleak outlook on life and low expectations will do that to a boy. I also wonder if the events that took place that night had anything to do with his death. I'm someone who's a firm believer in the paranormal. I've had tales passed down through my family. I've spent time reading about different types of paranormal folklore, and I listen to people's stories online frequently. I've always had a deep fascination for it, because I've even had my own experiences in the past. There's one experience I had recently that will always stick with me, especially when I prepare to go out on my nightly summer and fall hikes. I live in a small rural town in upstate New York. I'm just a stone's throw away from the Canadian border. My town is surrounded by vast farmlands and thick, sweeping forests. It's not uncommon to be met by our local flora and fauna if you choose to walk along the winding paths and roads near the tree line. I often prefer to walk at night, due to the bustling traffic during the day in the summer and fall seasons. In spite of being a small town in the middle of nowhere, we receive a lot of tourists from the south. One particular night, I decided to go out like I usually did. I was excited because it was the first time in a while that we had cooler temperatures. It had been hot and humid prior. I decided to bring my younger sister and her friend, who was spending the night, along with me. For privacy reasons, I'll refer to my sister as A and her friend as J. A and J were happy as always to join me on the adventure. Before leaving, we all made sure to gather important supplies. A was dressed in all black, so she was in charge of wearing my father's reflective PT sash and manning the LED flashlight. J was in charge of carrying a string bag full of water bottles and a few snacks. I stuffed my pockets with my compass, phone, and utility knife. Once we were ready, we practically skipped down the driveway. Upon breaking off my gravel drive and treading asphalt, the three of us paused a moment to discuss which direction we wanted to walk in. I had decided to take us south from our location to the road that leads directly to an old abandoned train station. From there, we would continue straight until we hit a nature trail I found. We resumed walking when I suddenly had a feeling of foreboding in the pit of my stomach. I usually get this feeling when I sense that we might encounter something dangerous along the way. It wouldn't be the first time we'd had a run-in with our local coyotes or even heard the scream of a migrating mountain cat. I jogged back to my front porch to equip myself with the large sharpened stick that I kept. Jay thought I was being paranoid, but I'm usually right when I trust my gut. From there, we made our trek down the road, laughing and talking about random things. We eventually came up on the section of the road that broke off into surrounding forest. It was pitch black, as there were no longer any streetlights illuminating our path. A asked if we should turn on the flashlight, but I declined. Our eyes were already well adjusted to the dark, and we needed to conserve battery power for the trail. We attempted to continue some conversation, but the sound of the crickets was deafening as we passed the thick woodland. The blaring of their chirping was so intense that my ears were beginning to ring. J and A got a little ahead of me as I paused a moment to block my ears and stop the ringing. Soon after uncovering my ears, I noticed it was jarringly silent around me, save for a small sound that could be heard about 20 yards from where we were standing. Hastily, I caught up with the girls and told them to be quiet for a moment. J and A simultaneously bombarded me with questions, but I shushed them with a hiss. I perked up my ears and listened more closely to the cry that was coming from the bushes in front of us. It sounded like a mountain lion cub. I felt my body tense up as I came to the realization that if a cub was there, then the mother was not far behind. This explained the sudden silence in the air. Jay urged us to turn back, but we were already halfway to our destination. I raised my stick, nudging them both to get in front of me and to walk slowly and quietly. I would be their eyes from the back if we were being stalked by the adult cat. That was the longest 20 yards we've ever walked. Bit by bit, we tiptoed closer to the sound of the cries. Jay was understandably frightened. We had a large predator, potentially watching our every move, and we were about to pass its baby. It wasn't long before the cries were just to the left of us in the brush. I walked behind the girls, partially turned sideways. I glanced over my shoulder frequently with my stick raised defensively to be sure we weren't being followed. The sound was behind us shortly as we continued our slow pace to pass it. "We're almost there, guys. Once we're away from it, we can just keep walking," I said with a whisper. We were about 4 feet away from the cub when suddenly the cries morphed into a low, deliberate groan. I felt my heart practically leap into my throat when a sharp cackle erupted from the darkness. It sounded like a strange whooping noise at first. The voice of the creature was unnatural. It was a garbled, distorted combination of a human laughing and a coyote howling. There was no time to find out what this thing was. We needed to get out of there, and fast. I practically shoved the girls as I commanded them to run, the urgency thick in my tone. The three of us broke into a panicked sprint down the long, dark road, the cackling still behind us. The volume never decreased as the creature kept pace with us. I could hear the sound of something large snapping twigs as it whipped through the bush. The day froze a few times in place, each time the thing would screech at us, much to my sister's dismay as she pushed her. I barked at them to keep running and not to stop until we reached the farmhouse that was coming into view in a clearing. I could see their powerful porch lights from where we were. As we approached the break in the trees, I did what any dumb person would do in a horror. I glanced back over my shoulder to get a look at the thing. I deeply regretted my decision. At first, all I saw were a pair of luminescent yellow eyes staring daggers into my soul. Then I saw a large shadow with elongated limbs emerge from the tree line, which I would later come to find was what my sister also saw. That was all I needed to see before I snapped my head back around and bolted forward with even more urgency. I don't usually have enough stamina to run that long, but adrenaline does incredible things. The three of us pounded into the circle of light provided by the farmhouse before slowing to a stop. I noticed that after reaching the clearing, the noises from the creature had slowly died down. We all decided to sit down as a wave of exhaustion encumbered us. My lungs burned as I struggled to steady my breathing. Jay was as pale as a sheet as she turned to me and asked, "What the heck was that thing?" I didn't know how to respond. My mind was reeling from the whole situation itself. "It was probably a squawker," A suggested. She often referred to those creatures like that because speaking their name would bring them to us. After a few moments, I glanced again in the direction we came. I begrudgingly stood up, thinking to myself, it was too dangerous to try to go back that way to get home, but it was the only way. I dug my cell phone from my pocket and decided it would be best to call my father to come pick us up in the truck. When he answered, he simply laughed and asked if we walked too far again. I said we decided to try running and tired ourselves out and that we needed him to come get us. He agreed and hung up the phone. We didn't dare leave the protection of the porch light. It was our only sense of safety from the thing that was lurking in the trees. It wasn't long before the headlights of my truck pierced the darkness. The three of us stood up and waved my father over. We piled into the truck soon after. All of us looked like we had seen a ghost, which piqued my father's interest. But none of us could bring ourselves to talk about what had happened. We skirted his questions as we were driven home. The next day, I started talking to one of my cousins online about the situation. He said it was weird because what I encountered is usually spotted in the Southwest. Upon asking him what he meant, his answer chilled my bones. "You were stalked by a skinwalker." He explained how to perform a cleansing, being that I had looked into its eyes. It was better to be safe than sorry. That night, I followed the steps my cousin gave me and then sat up for a while in my bed. I haven't encountered anything like that since, and I hope it continues to stay that way. To this day, I don't understand why it was there or why it targeted us. But now I am extra cautious when I go out at night. I carry an iron blade on me, just in case. Thanks for listening. Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to stay safe out there, because this world is full of strange and terrifying things. If you like and enjoyed these stories, then hit the like button, press the notification bell, and subscribe for more spine-tingling content, and we will see you in the next story.